Torture devices that left no mark. The quietest pain. We often think of torture as something bloody, brutal, and obvious. Iron Maidens, racks, thumbscrews, branding irons. But history has always held a darker, subtler current beneath the surface. A whisper instead of scream. A punishment without bruises. A device that leaves no scar. Just the echo of a scream that was never heard. In the silent corridors of castles, in the basements of asylums, behind the closed doors of inquisitors, there were methods that stripped away sanity, faith, and identity without ever breaking the skin. These were not designed to kill. They were designed to erase, piece by piece, until the victim no longer knew where the pain ended and they began. This is a story of torture that left no mark, and yet claimed more souls than war or disease. Because when the body heals but the mind remains trapped, what survives is not life, but something colder, something that still walks among us. The Iron Mask of Silence. The year was 1632, and the village of Notzingen in southern Germany was being torn apart by whispers. It began with a widow, Frau Erna Weitz, who claimed to hear voices behind her walls. Not divine or demonic, just ordinary. Men discussing politics, women weeping softly, a child humming the same lullaby over and over. The villagers laughed at first, until Erna clawed her own ears out in front of the church. Then came the magistrate's niece Greta, who refused to speak for 43 days and nights. Not a word, not a cry, not even a gasp when her hand was burned in an oven. When they finally coaxed a sentence from her, she said simply, "The mask told me not to." That's when the town elders summoned the inquisitor from Regensburg. He rode in on a pale horse, cloaked in gray, and carried a small leather case, no larger than prayer book. Inside it, villagers later swore, was the Iron Mask. It wasn't like the masks worn by plague doctors or executioners. This one had no nose, no eyes, no breathing holes, just a single slit where the mouth would be narrow as a needle's eye. Inside the mask, they said, was a tongue made of metal. It pressed against a real tongue when worn, holding it still, forcing the jaw shut. But it did more than silence. According to records, sealed but rediscovered in a monastic cellar in 1890, the mask did something to the mind. Victims reported hearing their own thoughts grow louder, not like internal monologue. No, like shouting, screaming, accusations in your own voice, regret, lies you told, desires you buried. Everything you'd locked away came pouring back, and the mask listened, and it remembered. Victims placed in the mask were not beaten, not cut, not burned. They were simply made to wear it, sometimes for days. A system of iron clasps held it tightly to the skull, fastened at the back with screws so fine they could be adjusted mid-session to increase pressure. No bruises, no broken bones, just a faint ring around the neck and cheeks. What happened inside was invisible. One priest, Father Jonas Keller, volunteered to wear for 1 hour as a demonstration of spiritual strength. He lasted 23 minutes. When they removed it, he began laughing uncontrollably. He tore pages from his Bible and ate them. Then he tried to swallow the mask. He never spoke again. We don't know how many people were subjected to the Iron Mask of Silence. Most records were destroyed in a fire, but a surviving letter from a nun at St. Gertrude's Abbey hints that over 77 women were subjected to it between 1632 and 1635. None were physically harmed, but all were declared insane and confined for life. No scars, no blood, no evidence. But the mask left something else behind, a kind of echo. In 1957, a psychiatric patient in Munich claimed she could taste iron in her dreams. She had no knowledge of medieval torture. When asked to draw what she saw in her nightmares, she sketched a perfect replica of the Iron Mask, down to the tongue. Her name was Greta Weitz. She was a direct descendant of the magistrate's niece. The Cradle of Stillness. There is a silence that can comfort. The hush of snowfall. The gentle stillness before dawn. But there is another kind, the enforced silence restraint, and it is anything but peaceful. In 1724, in the outskirts of Florence, Italy, there stood a sanitarium known simply as La Casa Bianca, the White House. It was run by a religious order of women who took no vow of silence, but practiced it religiously. Their motto, carved above the main doors, read, "Be still, and you shall be healed." What made La Casa Bianca infamous among physicians of the Enlightenment wasn't its theology, it was its methods. At the center of its basement level was a narrow room containing what they called the Cradle of Stillness. Not a cradle in the infantile sense, but a grotesque reinterpretation. A vertical coffin-like cage made of birchwood and tightly woven horsehair, shaped to hold a human body in an upright fetal position. No straps, no chains, just a design so precise, so suffocatingly snug, that once the subject was placed inside and the door closed, they couldn't move more than a few millimeters in any direction. Their knees were pressed to their chest. The neck was supported, but never allowed to lean. The arms folded across the ribs, palms inward. The head bowed. The result? Absolute stillness. Not for minutes, but for days. According to the sister journals, a set of hand-copied records discovered hidden beneath floorboards in 1908. The cradle was used on wayward minds. Not criminals, not violent offenders, but women who disobeyed, daydreamed, or doubted. The symptoms listed were restless thoughts, wandering speech, frequent blasphemies, and unnatural humor. For these, a 72-hour cycle in the cradle was the standard treatment. No bruises were ever recorded, no whip marks, no broken limbs. And yet, the effect was monstrous. One girl, only referred to as Luciana F., was placed inside the cradle after she reportedly interrupted prayers with laughter. She emerged 3 days later with completely white hair and a permanent, slack-jawed smile. She never spoke again. Another, Sister Mariana, volunteered to test the device on herself as penance for envy. She recorded the stages in a journal. Hour 6, discomfort. Breathing grows shallow. Heartbeat feels like it's echoing in my ears. Hour 14, I begin to hear whispers. Not in the room, but in my back. Hour 21, I can no longer tell where my limbs end. My body feels like it belongs to someone else. Hour 33, God is inside the wood. He is trying to remember my name, but I cannot help him. Hour 47, I hear myself crying, but I am not crying. Hour 66, I see myself. I do not love her. Hour 72, no entry. When she was removed from the cradle, her face was dry, her pulse normal, but her journal entries, found years later, were hidden behind the chapel altar, wrapped in cloth soaked with what is now believed to be horse blood. No reason for the preservation method was ever explained. The Cradle of Stillness was dismantled in 1793 when Napoleon's forces occupied the region and secularized religious institutions. Soldiers mocked the device, even posed for drawings in it. But by the time they returned to camp, several reported dream paralysis, waking in their tents but unable to move, unable to scream, hearing prayers chanted backward in a woman's voice. All of them died within a year. By the 20th century, the idea of therapeutic restraint had returned under new names: immobilization therapy, extended isolation, non-invasive psychological pressure. But the cradle had vanished until 1992. That year, an architecture student named Renata Colombo discovered a hidden floor beneath the now abandoned La Casa Bianca. Among the debris was a wooden skeleton shaped like a man-sized basket. Inside it, she found long strands of horsehair, braided and frayed. She took a piece home as a keepsake. Within weeks, her mother reported strange behaviors. Renata stood motionless for hours at a time. When spoken to, she blinked, but never moved her lips. She was found standing in the shower one morning, arms folded across her chest, water freezing cold. When the doctor examined her, he found no wounds, no trauma, but her body temperature was 2 degrees below normal. She remained that way, silent, perfectly still, for 11 days. On the 12th, she whispered, "Take me out now." But there was nothing holding her. The glass needle, the torture sound. Some tortures pierce the skin, others pierce the soul. And then there are those that pierce through the air, unnoticed by anyone but the victim. Invisible, inescapable, and maddening. In 1806, during the final days of the Holy Roman Empire, a secretive medical society in Vienna began performing experiments on prisoners sentenced to death. They were offered a chance at salvation in exchange for testing what was called a non-invasive perception device. The name was a lie. The device became known in hushed psychiatric circles as the glass needle. But it wasn't made of glass. It was sound. At the time, acoustics was still in its infancy, but Austrian physicist Carl Ludwig Dessen had theorized that certain frequencies could excite the nerves without ever touching the body. Inspired by the eerie tones of glass harmonicas, instruments made of spinning glass bowls played with moistened fingers. He wondered, what if sound would act as a needle? What if you could hurt a man from the inside? The experiments were carried out in stone rooms, carefully designed to resonate. Subjects were seated in wooden chairs with brass fittings. A violinist played behind a wall, but it was no ordinary violin. The strings were made of twisted sheep gut, and the bow had been treated with pine resin and human hair to create an unbearable friction. And what they played was not music. Each session began with a low droning note, a sound like thunder being held underwater. Then, slowly, it would rise to a frequency just below human perception. Most listeners heard nothing, but the subjects began to twitch. Their eyes would dart from side to side, searching for something. Sweat would bead along their lips. They'd start whispering to themselves. Some curled into a ball. Others screamed without meaning. There were no burns, no cuts, no bruises. Only tremors, nausea, and occasional nosebleed. But what happened after was worse. One subject, known in the records as Prisoner 406, was exposed for just 7 minutes. He never slept again. He complained of a hissing inside his skull, claimed that when he tried to lie down, the walls leaned in toward him, as if echoing the sound back. He died 11 days later of a brain hemorrhage, but the autopsy revealed no trauma, no sign of rupture. The coroner wrote, "It is as if his brain heard something it could not forget." Another subject, a 19-year-old washerwoman accused of theft, was exposed for 4 minutes. Afterward, she begged to be executed, sobbing that she had heard her mother's voice calling from behind the stone. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. Over time, Dessen refined the method. The bow was replaced with a rotating wheel. Instead of a violin, they used tension metal strips and a resonator box. The tones became more exact, more surgical. In a letter to his colleague, Dessen wrote, "The perfect frequency is the one that bypasses the ears entirely. They do not hear it. They feel it, in their teeth, in their spine, in their guilt. We have found a needle made not of glass or bone, but vibration." He was found dead in 1811, slumped over his desk, blood dripping from his nose. No cause of death was determined, but witnesses said his apartment hummed, for hours after he died, a strange, oscillating drone, like the world had caught its breath and forgotten how to exhale. The glass needle was suppressed by the Austrian government shortly after, buried in the archives of the Gesellschaft für Innere Ordnung, Society for Inner Order. But the idea never died. In the 1940s, the Soviets reportedly experimented with infrasonic frequencies to disrupt enemy morale. Soldiers exposed to these tones reported hallucinations, panic, even suicidal ideation. And in 2020, reports surfaced of embassy workers in Havana hearing strange, pulsing noises, followed by headaches, disorientation, and memory loss. No injuries were found. No trace of poison or impact. Only one thing in common. A sound no one else could hear. We like to think of torture as loud. Screams, chains, shouts for mercy. But the most effective pain? It doesn't have to shout. It only has to hum. And once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. The thought cage, Inquisition's invisible device. In the darkest corners of the Spanish Inquisition, torture was not always applied with iron or flame. Some methods didn't require rooms, ropes, or racks. They needed only belief and a mind to turn against itself. In 1478, a Dominican friar named Father Ignacio del Toro was appointed inquisitor of the city of Cuenca. He was known not for his cruelty, but for his precision. He rarely used traditional torture, waterboarding, strappado, or branding. Instead, his victims were said to break themselves. At the heart of this approach was a technique whispered of in hidden transcripts, an untraceable weapon the church never officially recorded. It was known among scribes and secretaries as la jaula, the pensamiento, the thought cage. No device was ever recovered. No instruments were found. But hundreds of testimonies, recovered from beneath layers of redaction, mention the same process: a chair, a blindfold, and 3 questions. The process began in complete silence. The accused, often a midwife, a scholar, or a former monk, would be led to a small, unlit chamber. There, they would be seated in a chair of polished wood, hands resting gently on their knees. A soft cloth would be tied over the eyes, not tight, just enough to obscure light. No threats, no screams, no blood. Then came the voice, calm, precise, always from behind. What do you believe? What have you hidden? What do you deserve? That's it. 3 questions, repeated over and over, sometimes for hours. The room remained still. The inquisitor never raised his voice. The cloth was never removed. But slowly, the victims began to answer themselves, according to the forbidden manuscript smuggled out by a novice monk in 1491. The process could last anywhere from 4 hours to 4 days. During that time, the subject was offered no food, only water. There was no pain, no sensory deprivation beyond the blindfold. But something happened, something deep. One woman, accused of conceiving impure thoughts, began whispering to herself after the 2nd day. When asked who she was speaking to, she replied, "To the other one." Another man, a librarian accused of possessing Arabic texts, began shaking uncontrollably on the 3rd night. He claimed he saw his father, who had been dead 20 years, standing just beyond the darkness and blindfold. "He's disappointed," the man sobbed. "He says I never really read the Bible, just memorized it." None of these visions were prompted. The victims did it to themselves. Over time, they confessed. They confessed to anything. Heresies they never committed, affairs they never had, thoughts they'd never considered, until the questions made them wonder. What do you believe? What have you hidden? What do you deserve? By the 1500s, other inquisitors began copying Father Ignacio's methods. But it never worked the same. Something was missing, something only he had mastered or hidden. Rumors spread that he used subsonic tones, herbs that induced hallucinations, or mirrors that created visual feedback loops. But the truth, according to secret Vatican memos dated 1624, was far simpler and far more terrifying. He didn't need anything but time. When the senses are muted and the self is left alone, the mind begins to decay. Thoughts no longer feel anchored. Memory distorts. The ego splits. It begins to doubt not just what it knows, but what it is. This is a thought cage, a prison with no bars, no locks, just reflection, echoed endlessly until belief collapses. It left no wounds, but victims were changed. In one of the few surviving reports in the trial of Father Ignacio, he was accused of exceeding even the Inquisition's bounds. A witness described a former subject of the thought cage. She looked like herself. She walked and ate and nodded politely, but her eyes were listening to something no one else could hear. And when Father Ignacio was finally arrested, they found no torture tools, only a chair, a blindfold, and a page with 3 questions written again and again in different hands. What do you believe? What have you hidden? What do you deserve? The room that blinds. The sensory isolation chambers of the East. Some torture doesn't require cruelty. It requires nothing. No fire, no blade, no scream, just the removal of everything else. During the Tang Dynasty, circa 8th century CE, a quiet revolution in punishment emerged deep within the imperial city of Chang'an. Among the sandstone monasteries and moonlit pavilions, a small, secluded structure stood behind the inner wall of the Hanlin Academy. It had no windows, no guards, and no name. Only a smooth obsidian seal over the door etched with a single character. Forget! This was the room that blinds. Historical records about the chamber are sparse, deliberately so. It was considered not punishment, but purification, used exclusively for high-ranking officials, poets, and scholars who had overreached the boundary of thought. Often these individuals had written texts that questioned Confucian harmony or referenced forbidden philosophies. They were not publicly executed. That would be a scandal. Instead, they were given time to recollect their purity. The process began with a tea ceremony. The accused would be offered a final warm drink. No sedative, no poison. It was meant to calm. Then, blindfolded and barefoot, they were led by two silent monks to the chamber. The door closed behind them, and then silence. No candles, no smell, no noise. The walls were built from an unknown mineral that absorbed sound. Every echo died instantly. Even the rustle of fabric seemed to vanish in the air. The floor was flat and cold, the ceiling low enough to touch. No bed, no chains, no meals, only a bowl of rice delivered once every 2 days. But the room did not torture the body. It tortured the awareness. Monks claimed the chamber was constructed in perfect sensory neutrality, so neutral that the brain, desperate for input, would begin generating its own, and what it generated was never kind. Victims began to hallucinate by the 3rd day. One scholar, Shui-Wan, reported, before retreating into silence, that the walls had started glowing like parchment. He saw entire poems he'd never written form in drifting lines of flame. Another, a painter named Li Zhao, clawed at the walls because he was certain his mother's face was trapped inside them. None of them emerged the same. The punishment was never permanent. Most were released after 2 weeks. But of the 32 confirmed subjects, 23 never spoke again. 3 took their own lives within a year. One simply wandered into the bamboo forest and was never seen again. The monks said they had been purified. In 1946, after the fall of Imperial Japan, a hidden compound in Manchuria was raided by Soviet forces. In it, they found blueprints nearly identical to the room that blinds, but larger, more clinical. It was labeled in Japanese as Room 23B, Sensory Distortion Cell. Eyewitnesses say it was completely silent inside. Even heartbeats felt distant. One soldier who entered for just 7 minutes claimed that his eyes started watering uncontrollably. Another began crying without knowing why. When asked what he experienced, he only said, "It wasn't empty. It was full of things that weren't mine." Today, sensory deprivation chambers are used in therapy, float tanks, and stress reduction, but most only simulate what the room that blinds accomplished completely. In these chambers, the subject loses not just connection to the world, but to themselves. No scars, no marks, but afterward, nothing looks quite real again. And for some, that's the worst pain of all. The flesh clock, where time itself became torture. Most tortures are measured in minutes, in screams, in scars. But some are measured in heartbeats. The final and most disturbing of these invisible devices was not made of steel or stone, nor hidden in a distant dungeon. It was worn like a robe, a creation of quiet genius or madness. From the court of Louis XV, they called it l'horloge de chair, the flesh clock. It was the invention of Dr. Guillaume Febvre, the personal physician to the king's problematic mistresses, those who had fallen out of favor but could not be dismissed publicly. His solution was revolutionary and diabolically elegant, a psychological torture that required no violence, only time, turned against the body. The device itself resembled a soft, padded suit made of tightly sewn silk panels, worn directly against the skin. Within the lining were tiny threads of gold and copper, attached to a series of weights that subtly contracted at fixed intervals. Once worn, the suit would tighten by a fraction of a millimeter every hour, just enough to be felt, but not enough to cause visible harm. The subject, unaware of the mechanism, was instructed to wear the suit as part of a therapeutic regimen. They were told it measured heartbeat and posture. In truth, it measured their resistance to madness. Dr. Fevre's journals, hidden in a Parisian wine cellar and rediscovered in 1931, describe the effects with clinical coldness. On day 1, the subject fidgets. On day 2, she begins to stretch compulsively. On day 3, she believes her own bones are growing. By day 6, she reports seeing her reflection shift, as if she is aging hourly. She begins asking how many days have passed. We do not tell her. By day 10, she reports hearing a ticking sound. There is no clock in the room. None of this is physical. The tension is minuscule. The sensation, imagined, perhaps, but the body reacts. The skin itches. The spine aches. Time becomes a predator, gnawing in regular intervals. One mistress, Elodie de Montparnasse, wrote in her diary, "The minutes are heavier than iron. I feel myself shrinking. My soul is wearing out thread by thread." After 14 days, she clawed at the suit until her fingers bled. The silk showed no damage. The weights inside had only tightened 0.8 centimeters. When she was finally allowed to remove it, she collapsed, not from hunger, not from pain, from the sheer relief of feeling time stop. Another subject, a playwright imprisoned for sedition, was kept in a flesh clock for 21 days. His final words before being removed were, "I am not sure if I am still real. I think I am just waiting." The genius of the device wasn't its mechanics, it was its illusion. The victim believed something was happening, something invisible, and their mind made it real. The brain, sensing subtle compression, begins compensating. Muscles tense, posture collapses, digestion slows, sleep is fragmented. The rhythm of life, once natural, becomes distorted. The victim is caught in a loop of anticipation, counting seconds they can no longer feel. No whip, no chain, no fire, just the unshakable dread that the next moment will be tighter. Today, the concept of time-based psychological degradation is used in solitary confinement, enhanced interrogation, and certain sleep deprivation tactics. But none approach the elegance of the flesh clock, a device that turned existence itself into torture. And if you think it's just history,